morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, depending on where you are. And thank you very much for joining this special webinar on transforming a new humanistic vision of global education into reality. My name is Jean Bernard, and I'm a member of the NISM group, which is proud to be co-hosting this event with the Global Campaign for Peace Education. We are delighted to welcome such an unexpectedly large number of educators to this event, and to have a lineup of panelists with such wide, deep, and relevant expertise in the policy and practice of peace building through education. So, mindful of the technical limitations of Zoom and in the interest of maintaining a stable connection, I must ask everyone except the opening speakers and panelists to keep your microphones muted and screens turned off. Do feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat and to post your questions in the Q&A. And we will try to address as many of these as possible during the open discussion toward the end in the last 15 minutes or so. So the first item on the agenda will be some opening remarks from the two co-hosting organizations, GCPE and NISM. First, I'd like to invite Tony Jenkins, coordinator of GCPE and managing director of the International Institute on Peace Education, to say a few words. Tony has more than 20 years' experience in directing and designing peace building and international education programs and projects, as well as leadership in the international development of peace studies and peace education. So over to you, Tony.
Thank you, Jean. We were very honored to have this opportunity to collaborate with NISM and UNESCO and many others who have been working to organize this webinar for actually maybe 6 or more months now. The Global Campaign for Peace Education, to just give you a little bit of a context to what we do, the campaign was launched in 1999 at the Hague Appeal for Peace Civil Society Conference that was held at The Hague in the Netherlands. And in particular, it was launched at an event there with a panel featuring preeminent scholars such as Betty Reardon and Johan Galtung and Desmond Tutu and other celebrated peace educators. Now, the participants of that conference and the campaign founders acknowledged in the campaign statement the following: that a culture of peace will be achieved when citizens of the world understand global problems, have the skills to resolve conflicts constructively, know and live by international standards of human rights, gender and racial equality, and appreciate cultural diversity and respect the integrity of the earth. And such learning cannot be achieved without intentional, sustained, and systematic education for peace. Now, the founders also noted the urgency in the necessity of such education as being acknowledged by the member states of UNESCO in 1974 with the original recommendation. So we are particularly invested in the success of the revised 2023 recommendation. The campaign itself operates as a non-formal, international organized network of individuals, institutions, and associations working to build public awareness and political support for the introduction of peace education into all spheres of education, including non-formal education, and in all schools throughout the world. And it promotes the education of all teachers to teach for peace. And you are all welcome to join the campaign, and I'll post a link later for you all to do so.
Thank you, Tony. So next, my colleague Andy Smart will give you the abridged version of NISM's story during the 5 years of its existence. Andy is an international publishing consultant with a background in teaching and educational and children's publishing. He specializes in textbook policy, planning, and development, as well as in English and Arabic medium, primary curriculum, children's reading, and children's books. Andy has been an incredibly active member of the NISM group since its founding in 2018, having taken the lead in the publication of 4 volumes of the NISM Global Briefs, which I hope many of you are familiar with, and with a 5th currently in the making. So, Andy, tell us about NISM.
Thanks, Jean, and thank you, Tony. It's a great pleasure to be joining you and welcoming the audience to this very important seminar. So NISM is a collective of academics and practitioners with diverse experiences and a common aim. We started NISM because we believe that education in schools, whether in the global north or the global south, has a wider purpose of personal and societal development, as well as academic attainment. And the name NISM is an acronym consisting of three main elements. We recognize the importance of the Sustainable Development Goals, and in particular, the value of Target 4.7 in guiding the global education community in terms of policy and practice. We also recognize that learning in schools is both social and emotional. And the third element of NISM emphasizes the vital role that curriculum and teaching materials play in enabling schools to embed the SDGs as well as social and emotional learning into classroom practice. We believe that by including the priorities of SDG Target 4.7 and an approach to teaching and learning the values, the social and emotional dimensions, textbooks in any setting can be turned from barriers to carriers of societal and personal development. We work mainly with countries in low resource contexts where textbooks are prized commodities that play a powerful role in teaching and learning. And in these contexts, textbooks are a necessary, though not sufficient, resource to help structure curriculum and teaching. Our activities in NISM comprise a busy program of open access publishing, including the Global Brief series, as Jean mentioned, which has now published 4 large volumes and includes almost 200 authors. And those in the audience who have not seen the Global Brief series will find plenty of articles of interest that are all concise, authoritative, and highly readable. We also organize online events such as today's webinar. We carry out research and create teaching and learning resources. We look forward to any inquiries you may have. And with that, back to you, Jean.
Thank you, Andy. I'm just seeing the amazing number of people and the amazing places they're joining from. I'm seeing Pakistan, Armenia, Nigeria, Thailand. Welcome to everybody. This is truly a global meeting. So to provide some important historical context for today's presentations and discussions, we'd like to share a short video from UNESCO that highlights the origins of what is widely known as the 1974 recommendation. This video is mainly about the earlier version, the 1974 recommendation, but much of what is in the later version, the 2023 recommendation, is maintained from the earlier version, as well as from the very origins, as the video will point out, of UNESCO. So let's go ahead and see the video. Thank you.
The idea of establishing a standard-setting instrument on education for peace and international understanding goes back to the very origins of UNESCO. In fact, the idea goes back even further to the predecessor of UNESCO, the League of Nations International Institute for Intellectual Cooperation. This institute combated prejudices and stereotypes in history and geography textbooks and actually issued an international declaration on the teaching of history in 1937. When UNESCO was born in the ashes of the Second World War, it was with the vision of helping to prevent that such devastating destructions and a denial of human dignity that had taken place during the war would ever happen again. UNESCO's mission was defined as building the defenses of peace in the minds of men. Education was essential in order to achieve this goal. This is why all through UNESCO's history there have been attempts to establish a standard-setting instrument on education for peace and international understanding.
So, so to move now from the past back into the 21st century, we'll hear first from our first panelist, Lydia Ruprecht, who is joining us from the section of Global Citizenship and Peace Education, Division for Peace and Sustainable Development at UNESCO headquarters in Paris. Lydia has been engaged for many years in education for building cultures of peace, human rights, and international understanding, and most recently in the coordination of the process leading to the adoption of the final draft of the 2023 recommendation, known commonly as the Recommendation for Peace, Human Rights, and Sustainable Development. So welcome, Lydia.
Thank you very much, Jean. Before I begin, I would like to start by warmly thanking the Global Campaign for Peace Education, NISM, for organizing this event. I could not say it enough to what extent you are among our closest allies. You and all the memberships and all those who have been who are part of these networks have inspired the document and its revision over the years, and we hope you will become its champion. So it's my pleasure to be able to address to you today and to present the instrument, what it looks like today. As explained, the recommendation is actually a revision of an existing document that was adopted in 1974 in the midst of the Cold War. That document was the legal foundation of SDG 4, Target 4.7. Maybe next slide, please. Thank you. So that 1974 recommendation no longer exists. It's been replaced by now what we call the 2023 recommendation, or what we prefer to say is the Recommendation on Education for Peace, Human Rights, and Sustainable Development. So this recommendation is one of 9 UNESCO recommendations on education. It's actually the only instrument that links peace and education and sustainable developments and human rights. It is, well, some call it as it's the heart. Sorry, is everything okay? I heard someone interject. Yeah. Okay. It is, some would say that it's the heart of the organization because it touches really upon UNESCO's mandate. It was adopted just recently and as indicated in November 2023 at the last session of UNESCO's General Conference, and I have to insist by consensus, which is an important accomplishment, meaning it did not go to vote, and that all member states, 194 member states of the organization, felt comfortable with the document and felt that it could be, it represented a consensus view. Now, the document was revised and then updated in its new form because it was deemed, though extremely relevant in many ways, needing to be updated to ensure that the document responds to contemporary challenges to human rights and sustainable development. And also there was a sense that there was a need to ensure that member states could once again agree, as the current configuration is, that our contemporary member states could once again agree on the role of education and its role in playing in building more sustainable, peaceful societies. Now, the document that was updated as actually was done over a period of 2 years, but in fact, it reflects those revisions, lessons learned over 50 years of practice in education, and a lot of what has been said over the years in a variety of networks, such as the Global Peace Education Network, the Bridge, I like because really is here, Bridge Network, NISM, and other actors around the world that have been working in this field, producing reports and findings. And of course, a series of consultations that were organized by the organization during the 2-year revision process, which sums up to around 3,000 people and from over 130 countries. Next slide, please. Now, the aim of this recommendation, that hasn't changed, and that is true. It builds on the existing, and it's the same, which is to ensure that the principles of the Charter of the United Nations, and particularly those written into Article 26 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that UNESCO's constitution and the body of human rights law is fully embedded in education. That is the overarching goal. Now, this has implications in the 21st century, and so the new document translates that in the sense that it needs that education systems need to be profoundly transformative and transformed. And that is a sort of a red thread or leitmotif of the whole recommendation, largely inspired by the work of UNESCO's Futures of Education report and also Transforming Education Summit, but also discourses around education over the past decades. The implication of this overarching aim is transforming education to be able to be truly transformative, and that means also paying greater attention to the knowledge, skills, values, attitudes, and behaviors that learners of all ages need to acquire to be able to engage in individual and collective action to ensure to trigger that type of transformation that is necessary. Next slide, please. Slide 4. Yes. So what is actually in the document? So in short, I won't go into the details. Hopefully this conversation will inspire you to read the document again and again. It contains a series of definitions that are actually been shared. We have a glossary or that maybe someone can drop in the chat. And that is in itself a bit of in some degrees an advancement with a definition of what is education for sustainable development. What can we commonly understand as global citizenship education? We reiterate what has been understood as human rights education following the declaration that was adopted at the Commission for Human Rights, etc. So building on legal advancements since 74, there are new definitions now that they're critical to understand the recommendation, and they're now in the text. The document also outlines 14, what we say, guiding principles that are recognized now by member states. Inspired by the SDG frameworks, and as I said, the body of law adopted since 74, international law. 14 guiding principles that are seen as critical to what is transformative education, to what makes education a transformative experience. And here, speaking to social movements and transformations over the decades that bring us to where we are today in the 21st century, we therefore refers to gender equality, the respect for diversity. This is important for UNESCO, given its work in the field of culture and all its cultural conventions, the issue of lifelong learning, etc. The document, so in addition to the guiding principles, it identifies a non-exhaustive list of learning objectives as examples of type of objectives that are expected learning initiatives for them to be actually transformative. The idea was to try to be as concrete as possible what we mean by transformative and not just abstract. What are those learning objectives that allow people to engage in transformation? And some of those are mentioned in the document. And finally, there are a list of action areas, 7 policy areas that cover the education system, and 6 levels of education, including non-formal, adult learning, etc., and an appendix for further reading. Next slide, please. So what are the highlights in very short? It's that it is grounded in a new understanding or strengthened understanding of peace. Speaking to many people here in the room who are certainly well placed to define it as well. It's nothing new, but it is new to many that the way the recommendations understands peace as a process, as a participatory process, that it's about peace at individual level on a continuum between peace between nations as well. So it's not just about global peace, which was probably more the intent in the 70s, whereas here it clearly makes the connection between peace from the individual, the personal, to the international, I would say political, and that it talks about personal health and well-being, rights and dignity of every individual being necessary to be able to engage constructively in education and transformative forms of education. The document also is really firmly, much stronger than before, firmly grounded in human rights and has adopted true human rights-based approach, building on, again, this legal instruments adopted since the 70s, notably the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which was a huge advancement, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the Declaration on Human Rights, Education and Training are landmark instruments. So building on those language and their content the recommendation really covers human rights. It has a systematic, lifelong, and life-wide approach, as explained, covering a wide range of areas of understandings of education, not just formal, non-formal, and informal. And also, importantly, and here speaking to you in particular, to understand that it introduces the idea that civil society, of course, but especially learning communities in general, not just organized civil society, but it's not just state actors that have a key role to play in implementing the recommendation, and it's obviously a duty for member states to support and to engage with actors outside of state actors. So it really adopts a participatory, a whole of society approach, it wasn't there before. And this is something we heard directly from young people, of course, very loudly, but from teachers and educators and from communities, and that we also learned from the work being done in culture on living heritage and the importance of have community engagement in the learning process. And so that was well heard and integrated in the document. Finally, there are substantive innovations like bringing in recommended technical guidance on learning environments, on a school climate, and also emphasizing monitoring and policy learning, building on what is now commonly said around other forms of other recommendations that have been adopted in recent years. And the last point is that the recommendation offers a common ground, as we say, for different educational approaches that many have seen as competing: education for sustainable development, or GCD, global citizenship education, or education for peace and human rights, or education for health and well-being, or social emotional learning, that these are approaches to education or expressions that circulate and can create confusion among some, and initially governments. So it was important for UNESCO to offer a document that could bring these approaches together and show the connections and how they can be mutually supportive and are working towards the same goal. And this is why, for all these reasons, the instrument is not intended to be relevant and applicable far beyond 2030, and hopefully for another 50 years. So actually it's not final, slide 6, please. Next slide. About the recommendation. Here is a graph that just presents things succinctly. I won't go into, you'll get a better sense of the document by reading it. But there, it's just an illustration of how we try to think how the different levels of education connect with the policy areas and how we structure the document. Because we do cover all different policy areas, including pedagogy, curriculum, teacher development, et cetera, textbooks and learning materials, et cetera, and different levels of education. But I won't dwell on this to try to keep within my 8 minutes. Next slide, please. Absolutely. Next slide, slide 7. Thank you. So the document also, we really tried to make this a tool. And this we heard very clearly from civil society actors, notably Really, that's here around the table, but he's not the only one, who's emphasized it, again, that we need legal instruments, of course, but they have to be living instruments that be used and lead to action and transformation. So for us, the way the document was crafted is to see it as of course, a call to action. It's in the process of advocacy, but of course, but it's an advocacy tool to encourage actors, civil society actors, a variety of actors to take action. So it's very concrete, and it really has that openness to the whole society approach. So it's about taking action, advocating for action, and also as a benchmarking tool. We hope that the document is seen. We realize that there's a bit of an ideal scenario. It's an aspirational document, not in that way, but it is an instrument that one can look at and say, well, how to measure how far they are and where should I be. And my advocacy, my organizing, and our policy reforms transformation. Next slide, please. And so from that perspective, we have here some ideas on who can use the instrument. We are very mindful of the fact that it can be used by a variety of people. These are some examples of how each stakeholder could be using, including academics and civil society actors, to shape policies, shape strategies and initiatives, to demand for greater support and training, to organize activities at the school level, et cetera. again, maybe we could share the PowerPoint after the event so you can look at some of these ideas more closely. Now, what are the follow-up plans? The document having been now being adopted, it has to be officially signed and by the Director General and the President General Conference after the reading committee, translated in all official languages. It's still being controlled. That's coming out very shortly. And we're involved in advocacy work at the moment, organizing regional events. There are things planned in Asia. And we're developing events in every region. We're developing digital public information toolkits. We plan to go also in the field of going to capacity building. And this is where we're developing a global implementation guide and a gap analysis tool to be able to take this document right down to the country level, local level. What does that mean concretely? Many of you already are actually contributing to this, the development of these tools, so that's coming up. And of course, the whole monitoring and reporting, which is a whole realm in of itself. Reporting takes place every 4 years, so we need to update the guidelines, building on the existing guidelines that were used for the previous recommendation. It serves for global monitoring of 4.7, but to do better in that respect. Next slide, please. So what are the early signs of ownership that we'd like to mention? There are regional, I mentioned regional launches with policy dialogues foreseen in Bangkok and also in Latin America. National consultations have already started independently from UNESCO. We have, for example, in Denmark, the ASB annual event will take place on the recommendation, and in Egypt, UNESCO chairs organizing an event. And finally, other activities on the way. Last slide, please. Monitoring and reporting. Just a word, because I think this is something maybe some would be interested in, that what we are planning for the future is to learn from the challenges of the past, to improve the quality of the reporting and its coverage, to give a serious think to duplication and how data is being collected or information is being collected by different sources in UNESCO, addressing similar issues. How can we avoid that and build on existing reporting mechanisms to improve the depth and quality of what member states report on, and also, of course, the inclusiveness of the data collection process on the monitoring. It is not just member states, but the member states are also invited to involve broader communities to ensure the quality of the reporting. So see, these are some of the issues we're thinking about when it comes to the monitoring and reporting in the years to come. I think this ends my presentation. I'm sorry, I think it went over 8 minutes. Apologize. And here you have the QR code with the actual text of the recommendation. That's it. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Lydia. So much to unpack here.
Yeah.
Thank you for trying to stay within the 8 minutes and for giving us this very rich introduction. I think most of the other presentations will be building on what you've said. And so next we have Hela Lotsiska from South Africa, who is Distinguished Professor in the Education Department of Rhodes University, South Africa, where she is Director of the Environmental Learning Research Center and is a member of the South African Academy of Sciences. She served on numerous national and international scientific policy forums to advance education for sustainable development policy and practice globally. She was also a member of the expert group convened by UNESCO to revise and update the 1974 recommendation. She will speak on the possibilities in the revision of the 1974 recommendation. So I'm turning on my timer this time, and I'll warn you when you're getting close. Okay, here we go.
Thank you very much, Jean, and thank you very much to GCP and NISM for the invitation to be here this afternoon and to speak about this incredible process actually that we were part of as an international expert group, and to just share a few thoughts actually of what that process was about and what some of its meaning may be for us as an educational community concerned with the world and the way it is structured and changing and so on. So I thought, when I think about this recommendation, I often think about time. I think about two different times, the two related recommendations, a revised recommendation for a time to come, because of course it's only just being, as Lydia said, adopted and accepted and so on now. And then what possibilities open up when one looks at something like this. So I just sort of chose a few images just to sort of share my thinking with you also. And of course, a recommendation is something quite serious, actually. It's a legal instrument. Let me just hide these, yeah. It's a legal instrument, internationally binding legal instrument. So when member states adopt this, they actually are tying themselves up to being accountable for what is being said on the paper. So it's a huge task. And I must say, Lydia and her team have been working on this for years, not just a short time. It's 3 to 4 years that this has been in the making. So something like this is made in time, and it's made in its time. And the first round of this, of course, being 1974. And we can ask ourselves what happened in 1974, and I'll come to that in a minute. But it's also made with past, adopted languages, because in the UN system, you work with adopted language. You can't introduce, too much wild new language, if you like. And that's also then, developed with a vision of time to come, the possible. So what is possible in 2024, where we are now and beyond. So as I said, it's really made me think a lot about time, and thinking, trying to understand time and what time actually means in our societies and so on. And I came across this lovely piece from physics, actually, on the order of time and what time actually is. And Ravelli talks about it being this relationship between memory and anticipation. And this is a source of our sensing of time as time, and also of ourselves as ourselves. So it's quite a kind of profound piece. And it also makes you think about time, and time not being linear. And yet we look at, dates 74, 2024. And so we sort of talking in a 50-year window here. But it's not really that linear, although it is different. So if we look at 1974, we had this kind of new little Honda car being developed, and it was TV time, and we had, the end of the Vietnam War, we had the Cold War, we had floods, we had new inventions, trying to find a battery for a case for electric vehicle batteries. Can you imagine? The impeachment of Nixon, the oil crisis, and of course we had Bob Marley. So we had lots of stuff happening in 1974. And when this first recommendation came out, it was indicated as being very progressive in its time. So it's a landmark legal instrument in education. It brings together for the first time ever in a standalone document, peace, international understanding, human rights, and fundamental freedoms into education. It was said to be remarkably bold and a modern document, and very visionary. And I think that is really what its beauty is. And to, come to have to revise something like this is quite a task, because you need to understand about that time, and you have to understand about the time now. So some of the key concepts and absences in the 1974 recommendation, what was present was international understanding, peace, that education should contribute to human rights and fundamental freedoms. It was far-sighted, it was interdisciplinary, and it was really closely related to the 1973 human rights documentation and processes, which of course have shifted, in the time between then and now. And so what was absent was nothing on climate change and sustainable development. Gender equality and rights of women was not there. A culture of peace, as Lydia was saying, not just, no war, but actually building a culture of peace. Democracy wasn't in there, and children's rights. So we can see, much happening between this period of time. But of course, we also see the need to revisit, because those earlier human rights are as important today as they were then. And yet we have this new generation of human rights that we're trying to deal with. And we see that playing out, the diversity, both the similarity and the diversity in just the everyday events around us. Nowadays, of course, much more emphasis on climate change and so on, this year being the hottest year so far on record, the return of war back into our discourses, the issues of gender and race, and then we have new issues like artificial intelligence and what to do with electric cars, and how to deal with Google and Google Meet and all of these kinds of things, you know, the digitalization of life. So this new revision is really trying to do the same thing, but in a different time. So given the urgency and complexity of contemporary trends and threats to global peace, more elaborate and new responses than those inscribed in the 1974 recommendation are required to address the challenges of today. And that, in a sense, was the brief that we got from UNESCO, along with all of this background material. It's unbelievable the amount of normative instruments that have been produced, you know, between 1974 and 2024. There's conventions and recommendations, there's international instruments, intergovernmental initiatives, and there's been so many of them that all of us have been part of, including this shift in the discourse of human rights. Third generation rights moving much more towards solidarity and culture and environment and so on. And then we see, you know, these movements in education emerging. And of course, the most recent being this big summit on transforming education. And we're seeing this move towards bringing things together, as Lydia said, you know, bringing possibility of coherence to these normative instruments that have been emerging. So we see big shifts. We see shifts in the title. I think you've all been able to see that. You know, cooperation is there, global citizenship and sustainable development, and then the revised title. So sustainable development now being in the title where it wasn't before. There's also, quite interestingly, if you look into the document, there's very similar concepts, but they have new meaning. They frame differently. So peace is not just the absence of war, it's peace building and building cultures of peace. Human rights is not just to be integrated into education, but to be deeply embedded in education. There's an expanded frame for human rights. Inclusion is much more widely defined. Children's rights, women's rights, human and the more than human being included. There's new concepts that have come in, quite a lot of them. So peace building, climate change and environmental sustainability, gender equality, dignity and diversity of learners. The issue of digitalization is in there. Multilingual skills, indigenous and mother tongue languages is in. Non-formal and informal, the relationship between them. Assessment, and I really think this is a very important one that supports all learners and learning. And then the concept of co-constructing, you know, inter and transdisciplinary sciences is in there, and of course a new role for TVET. So many things that are kind of coming in that are offering new possibilities for rethinking education, reimagining education. There's also all these action areas that Lydia talked about, and a very strong intention was to provide a very strong action-orientated directionality in the recommendation so that it could translate from policy into practice. So there's a very strong feature of the document, and I think some very useful perspectives in there that can be picked up by people. And then, of course, there's also a much stronger commitment to follow up and review at different levels, and the monitoring and evaluation being a new feature. It wasn't in the previous recommendation at all. So some important new things happening there. The educational scope is also much wider than in the previous document. So, and there's also a different kind of commitment to a different type of learner. So we read in there, you know, learners and teachers as agents of change. And there's a strong commitment to transformative education, as Lydia has already mentioned. So what happens next? You know, so we implement this recommendation. It's 2023. We're heading to 2050 or 2073 if we count the 50-year window. And we need to be alert to not only what has been and the adopted language that we have and its new progressive holding together in the recommendation, but also to what might be. So we need to stay open-minded about the movement in society. For example, climate change, you know, we're currently arguing for a 1.5 degree world at present via our adopted language. But what if this does not prevail? When we look at democracy, we made after the Sustainable Development Goals. We don't really know yet. The shift in global demographies, by 2050, Africa will be home to half of the world's children. Does the document take account of that? Youth unemployment, it's a major issue rising all over the world. Changing nature of work. So there's still much that could have been included actually in the document. And so I think these processes need to remain open, need to remain reflexive, and also open to a new generation of human rights around digital technologies, biomedical rights, and so on that are emerging. So just to say, you know, the journey is not over when we have a recommendation like this. And one of the things I think we're really going to have to do is really think about the language of learning, because you can see the language of learning is being picked up into the world of artificial intelligence and its construction. So we may actually need to be protecting the language of learning as we move forward as an educational community. So just to finish off, I think what the recommendation can do is it can help us to maintain the tension between pasts and actions that catalyze futures. It can loosen what is stuck. It can open up possibility knowledge for transforming education anew in a different time. And it can also offer tools. It offers new tools that can help us to do this, you know, both in policy and practice, as Lydia also pointed to. And I think that we'll need to do this in non-linear but interconnected ways and at all levels and on all fronts, because the situation is such that we are going to need to do that. And I think that this achievement is absolutely enormous. Lydia's point about the consensus, you know, it was an unbelievably complex process, highly political, because these are very political issues that we are bringing into education, and yet we have consensus from that. So just in closing, I think, for me, I think these are unprecedented times. You know, our carbon emissions are already stacked up for the next 50 years in the atmosphere, and our ice is melting. And so what we do in education in the next few years will really matter. It's really, really important that this revised recommendation is carried into action as, you know, in the best possible way. And I think to really appreciate the possibilities that it opens for transformation in education, and to have an instrument like this offers such a huge anchor for all of the work that so many people have been doing for so long. So thank you very much for having me here this afternoon, and we can carry on. Thank you.
Okay, I did notice in the chat, at least one participant mentioned that he had been born in 1974
Yeah.
in linear time. Thank you so much. We are a little bit running a little bit late, so the next speaker, I hope, is Jordan Naidu, who will enlighten us within 8 minutes on the critical connection between the revision of the 1974 recommendation and the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals. Jordan has led a number of important initiatives during his career, including UNESCO's global coordination of the SDG 4 Education 2030 agenda. He also served as director of UNESCO Kabul office and country representative to Afghanistan, and most recently as the acting director of the UNESCO Institute for Educational Planning. So Jordan, please enlighten us.
Thank you very much, Jean. First, let me thank the Global Campaign for Peace Education and NISM for inviting me to join this discussion. And thanks also to Lydia and to Haila on setting the seal for my discussion. I think the recommendation comes at a critical juncture for SDG 4 and the SDGs as a whole at this midpoint of the SDGs. We still have, you know, just over 5 years to go, and it's really, to some extent, somebody can argue that the SDGs, and particularly SDG 4, is kind of shifting off the agenda. And I think the recommendation itself gives us a really good opportunity to refocus on SDG 4, as well as, in particular, on SDG Target 4.7. In a way, and this may be debatable, Lydia referred to the Transforming Education Summit, which I think was a really important event, and truly refocused attention to education. But at the same time, I believe that it may have had some unintended consequences for SDG 4. To some extent, it took away some of the focus on SDG 4 and it reinforced to an extent individual agency priorities and different coalitions removing some of the emphasis away from SDG 4. So I believe that the revision and especially Lydia's kind of emphasis on the call to action gives us an opportunity to refocus on Target 4.7, which specifically focuses on the issue of that are central to 1974 recommendation. Next slide, please. As you can see, and Lydia did refer to some of this, but I wanted to point out the clear alignment between SDG Target 4.7 and the revised recommendation. Central to both are the issues of human rights, gender equality, and a promotion of culture of peace and nonviolence and global citizenship. The correspondence between the language of the two is unique in some ways, and I think it provides a rallying point for advancing 4.7, SDG Target 4.7, which, as I've already pointed out, I believe has fallen off the agenda to an extent. So the re-emphasizing the language of both SDG 7 and the advocacy that will be involved in taking forward the revised recommendation gives us an opportunity not only to advocate, but to provide a framework for action around the central issues of both Target 4.7 and the revised recommendation. Next slide, please. I'm not going to go in much detail on this, but as Lydia already pointed out, the critical event, that refocused attention on education in the last couple of years was the Transforming Education Summit, which re-emphasized the importance of education for peace building and transformation both in education, but also through education. And it highlighted also the common elements between the recommendation and Target 4.7. And to some extent, it reinforced the cross-cutting targets across the entire SDG agenda around peace building, around climate change, around transformation, and the new priorities and challenges that the global community faces around things like artificial intelligence, digitalization, the increasing inequality in many parts of the world. So in a way, this gives us an opportunity to really unpack transformation from an action-oriented position rather than purely from a rhetorical position. So in a way, I think this is one of the greatest opportunities that the recommendation provides, so that we can turn empty words into action that produces significant outcomes for all. Next. So one of the things that I thought would be important to look at in relation to how SDGs and SDG 4 has evolved, and where we have an opportunity to use the revised recommendation to the advantage of all in focusing on the key elements in Target 4.7. One of the central sort of areas for the SDGs in terms of monitoring, in terms of focusing on priorities, has been the annual high-level political forum where countries provide voluntary reports on selected SDG targets. And as you can see from the slide, over the years, the emphasis has been on different targets relative to a selected number of SDGs. And it's interesting that and perhaps not interesting, but not unexpected, that the 2023 HRPF the focus was largely on accelerating recovery from the COVID-19 and re-emphasizing the need for full implementation of the comprehensive SDG agenda. It re-emphasizes the interlinkage and indivisible nature of the SDGs, while at the same time focusing on selected goals, goal 6 on water and sanitation, 7 on clean energy, and 9 innovation, 11 and sustainable cities, and as in multiple years, the continuing focus on the partnership for moving the goals forward. I think at this midpoint, what also came across from the last HLPF forum is that there is a concern that we are off track in fulfilling the complete SDG agenda. In a number of the discussions, the term polycrisis came up, re-emphasizing the interlinked nature of the current global challenges. And what was also important, I think, from the 2023 HLPF, it really emphasized that it is a time for action. And this echoes, I think, the point Lydia made about the central and key difference in the recommendation, revised recommendation, and the emphasis on action. Next slide, please. So I think as we think of the connection between the recommendation and SDG 4 and the SDG agenda as a whole, the 2024 HLPF provides a real opportunity to make this linkage clear and to use both the Target 4.7 priority and the SDG action around the revised recommendation to move forward the joint and common priorities. Because if we look at the focus for 2024 HLPF is again emphasizing the integrated, indivisible, and interlinked nature of the Sustainable Development Goals. It chooses the selection for 2024 is Goal 1, end poverty in all its forms everywhere. Goal 2, end hunger, achieve food security. Goal 13, take urgent action to combat climate change and its impact. And Goal 16, promote peaceful and inclusive societies. And as I said as well, in the each year, focus on Goal 17 and 7 partnership. So if we look at both the revised recommendation, SDG Target 4.7, the choice of the focus for 2024 HLPF, and particularly Goal 13 and 16, gives us the opportunity to really use the recommendation during the HLPF discussions and events surrounding and building up to the HLPF, which is in June. So I think the next few weeks are critically important for UNESCO to make this connection and highlight it as they ramp up the advocacy work on the recommendation. Next slide, please.
Sorry, Jordan, we're coming up way past 8 minutes now.
Okay.
Could you please wind up?
So I'm going to conclude. In fact, this, in some ways, this is my last slide. So the possibilities, for the connection is, and I think there was some reference also in the chat about working groups and a joint kind of attention to setting up something together. So I think the recommendation for UNESCO is to take this forward through a clear platform and a joint monitoring sort of entity drawing on the multiple stakeholders. The last slide, and I'll conclude in 30 seconds. So in conclusion, I think the SDGs offer an opportunity, but we haven't taken that opportunity to the extent that was possible. So in the face of an increasingly volatile, uncertain, and complex, ambiguous world, education can make the difference. But we have to embrace both the opportunity and challenges in a way that reflects true transformation. And transformation, I think it's important to consider, is not a one-off event. There's, for me, there's the the notion of always tinkering towards utopia. So our collective efforts don't end with one action. It's a continuous, ongoing partnership that has to be maintained and strengthened constantly. Thank you.
Thank you, Jordan, for making these very important connections. And these lead right into the next presentation from Rilli Lapalainen. I hope I got your name almost right. Who will focus on the guidance provided to member states in the revised recommendation. He is the founder and co-chair of Bridge 47 Network, a global network to bridge different actors to support, promote, and implement SDG 4.7, Target 4.7. Bridge 47 Network also does advocacy, brings different actors together, and raises awareness of the importance of the right to active participation in societies. His background is a combination of more than 30 years long career from local to global level to fight for global solidarity and sustainable development. So over to you, Rilli. Right.
All right. So some kind of summary about the Bridge 47, which we definitely built. We existed already before the SDG 4.7, but that has been really some kind of nominator for us. So we have more than 1,000 individuals all over the world. Majority of us are doing advocacy, and I really believe on that we definitely need to use now the new recommendations for really making the whole SDG 4.7 to be on very, very carefully and really taken seriously as well. So that's our motivation, is really using the advocacy or doing the advocacy through the network. And I'm more than happy to tell that more, those who are interested in later, how to join and all of that. But like said, many of the colleagues, the SDG 4.7 from our point of view is really the tool how to really make the whole Agenda 2030 to be implemented. Like Jordan just said, that is very, very much related to all the SDGs. I really believe that also is some kind of soul for the whole Agenda 2030 philosophy. So it's not only the SDGs, but it's much more. And I think that we should see that also in parallel as a tool inside in the education, but also outside of the education. And I'm coming back that in a minute. We also are really, really happy about the recommendations in that way that finally the formal, non-formal, and informal aspects are really taken seriously. I'm not really saying that it hasn't taken at all, but now I really see that it's really the good step in the right direction, because definitely there's a lot which is happening out of the formal school system, and we definitely need to use about those opportunities. Also, I think that it's really, really important one is that we really understand about this formal and informal education, also the intentional and unexpected learning which is happening, because I think we are by accident learning, all of us, and if we are capable and if we have the skills to really learn and be inspired and curious of the societies, I think we can definitely learn a lot. And again, referring for the recommendations, I think that it gives the legal frame for that. But again, from our point of view, it's very important one to put that more in the practice. Like I said, it's really, really fundamentally important to really keep in mind that the lifelong learning aspect, it's really crucial part of the recommendations as well. And this is just for informing that exactly how little the human beings are learning in the formal setting. Again, it's fundamentally important, but it's not at all enough. And that's why I think that the huge potential of the whole recommendation is really that we can really have the all ages of the learners, wherever they are, really included and really using the education in the educational way as well, that we can really get the good results coming out. But I think that the really important parts also is that we need to see that as a tool for systematic change. There's quite a lot of talks about the transforming or transformation, and that means quite a lot. It's really a part of the systematic change, which is really difficult because it's so abstract. But I think that we as educators and learners as well, I think that we should challenge ourselves to really think about how holistically we can really keep on moving all the aspects. So really making the changes in the policies and the structures, we need to really understand the context and the history. We need to understand the mental models. We need to understand the relationships and the power relationships as well. And we need to find the practical tools how we can make the change. And I guess that many of you are very aware about this iceberg model, which really illustrates about that majority of our work, what we're doing, including us who are doing the advocacy, it's so easy to concentrate on the events or the some kind of reactive or the seeing the visible ones. But there's much more things what we need to really think about further and seeing what is behind and then what is under the water. And in the lowest level, the mental models. And what we really talk about here is that what are the changes in the mental models, what we used to use, what we have practiced, and how we can really challenge ourselves to really change the behaviors. Because in the end, nothing's going to be changed if the behavior of the human beings is not going to be changed. So these are some kind of backgrounds, how we really see the situation, and we are really happy to, and like Lydia said, we contributed quite a lot during the process when the negotiations and the drafting of the recommendations was made. That was really good example also that the other stakeholders managed to contribute. So I'm very thankful for that. But now exactly the real job is only beginning. And that really means that it's responsibility of the member states to implement that, but it's the responsibility of the other actors to make sure that the member states are going to do that. And that's why I think that it's really important that we think how we do the support for the member states, let's put it in that way. Of course, because it's in the territory of the education area under the ministries of education in majority of the member states in the world. We definitely need to deal with them and encourage the member states or the Ministry of Education to really have this wider perspective, really including the formal, informal, and non-formal lifelong learning and transforming education itself, so that we are not only repeating the things how it used to be, but how exactly that learning and education can be transformative inside in the education system. In parallel, I think we should use about this opportunity now to transform the societies, because this frame and these recommendations can help us to do that. So really thinking that how could we use the education and upgrade the role of the education, not only being as some kind of development box or the education box, but really understanding that the behavioral change is going to be changed in the world and the societies. So the education has a wider role than not only being there in the education system. And then in the end of this implementation, I think that it's very important that all the stakeholders are invited to be the actors in the implementation. So not again just only following that what is happening in the societies organized by the ministries of education, but it's really trying to encourage the national-wide groupings who can really collectively think about how we can really implement that together. So that's really important. Also, there's a question of the resources, because I think that it's needed to be seen so important that there will be the allocation of the resources to do that together. There's also need for the communication, because without having the access for the information, it's difficult to motivate the people as well. So they need to really have this kind of information what we are here sharing today here, for example, so that people really understand that how important the recommendations are and how it could be really seen as a useful tool and an invitation to join. And then the measuring, this is one of the aspects where I think that it's important to really be in the beginning as a part of that measuring, not only after the 4 years when the governments need to report back to the UNESCO, but it has to be the opportunities for really measuring that in a shorter period as well, where again you can really see where the progress goes in the positive or the negative side. So overall, I think that it's really the great opportunity for us to really use that In the national context, I think that that's really, really important one, because without that, it's only the paper. I think that we have to really find the motivation in the national level. We in the Bridge 47 are doing our best to support the colleagues and really inspire them to take this role. I agree as well that we need to act in the global level as well. And I think that for example, the HLPF, like, by the way, we have organized as a Bridge 47 every single HLPF as a side event. So happy to think about that option. But also there's summit for the future coming in September as a one example in the UN processes. So there's a lot of other opportunities where I think that we as an educational community, I think we need to really think about those options, how we can really contribute and promote, because anyway, the member states are sitting in the UN. So again, the similar structure could be used on there. But I think I will stop now. I hope I was on time. So thanks a lot for this opportunity.
Jean, for some reason, we can't hear you.
No.
There we go.
Are we good? Okay. Sorry, we should speed up a little bit now. We have about 20 minutes left. Everything is so rich and interesting. It's very hard to cut you off, but the next speaker, I'm sure, will stay within 8 minutes. Tony Jenkins, we're coming back to Tony, who is, again, the coordinator of the Global Campaign for Peace Education, managing director of the International Institute on Peace Education, also assistant professor in the program in Justice and Peace Studies at Georgetown University. So, Tony, please hurry up. I'm sure you will.
I'll do my best. It's good to follow, really, because you address some of the things that I want to talk a little bit about today, and particularly the role of non-formal, informal, lifelong learning, with the recommendation in understanding that it is these actors who are coming from civil society who are going to play a major role and have a major responsibility and assuring member states take the necessary action. So what I want to just talk a little bit about today is sort of the why, the how, and some of the potential and challenges of harnessing civil society as partners in the implementation. And I'm actually very pleased to see the emphasis on civil society partnership integrated throughout the revised recommendation. That's something that Lydia and Cecilia and other colleagues and I at UNESCO spoke at length about during the technical advisement stage of the revision process. So now we need to think a little bit more about, how we effectively pursue this and why. So let me start by talking about the why, and I'll give a little context from my own experience. About 5 years ago, the Global Campaign and the International Institute launched a joint advocacy effort that had a very simple message, and that message was there's no peace without peace education. And the intention of that campaign was to help reveal the vital role that the education, particularly non-formal education, plays in both transforming and preventing conflicts by sharing stories of a lot of the different types of educational interventions that operate behind the scenes of everyday peace processes. So we publicly acknowledge, we celebrate high-level negotiations that result in the signing of peace accords. And I always think about this like in the context of Colombia, when the government there signed the accord with the FARC in 2016. But those outcomes would not have been possible without those years of sustained efforts of non-formal educators who are working to capacitate citizens and teachers with the knowledge, the skills, and the capacities and the attitudes necessary to prevent violence and transform conflict. And in the case of Colombia, these efforts are now being sustained through a more formal integration of peace, truth, and reconciliation into the formal curricula. So this is an intention that I think is observed with clarity in the recommendation, and particularly around Action Area 63, which specifically encourages member states to promote and recognize non-formal education and informal learning as it plays a very important role in empowering children, young people, and adults so they become agents of change. And it goes on to address that such learning can include supporting civil society organizations and youth organizations, which strengthens resilience in the face of crisis, and supports non-formal means of expressing and transmitting culture within communities. And this latter point here on cultural expression, I think, is something that's particularly important. In a lot of different contexts, forms of critical peace education, I think, are vitally needed to disrupt normative political and cultural processes and assumptions. So we know, for example, of course, that all education has some kind of social and political purpose. And the curricula and the pedagogies that get designated by policymakers, whom are often politicians and not necessarily educators, are directed towards the achievement of some kind of political outcome. And sometimes these things are explicit, sometimes they're implicit. So we can't overlook that in many contexts that peace education can represent a threat to normative political agendas. And so we see and we know throughout history and even today that education can be weaponized to foster xenophobic attitudes. And it can often instill values of militarism, right? And these things are seen as necessary to maintaining political war efforts. So when we see education get guided by these values, it contributes that sort of normalization of violence, of which this recommendation seeks to undo. So in this sense, this authentic partnership between states and civil society actors really needs to be one that's rooted in a collaborative and dialogical exchange. And this is something that I think is really essential to healthy and functioning democracies. So the answer to the question of why, it's complex, it's multifaceted, but in essence, I think that civil society and non-formal education actors often reflect the will and the concerns of people, particularly those who are most affected by conflict and other threats. And their perspectives are really vital for the protection of democracies and the assurance of human security. And further, non-formal partners are essential to legitimizing the principles of the recommendation, right? These principles can't be perceived as some sort of imposed set of guidelines from above. They need to be understood as mutually constructed and owned by all. Now, the how, it comprises the both political and pragmatic concerns and possibilities, and a lot of these mechanisms of collaboration are spelled out in the action areas of the recommendation. I'll just highlight a few that I think are really important for us to think about. So under the action areas of governance, accountability, and partnerships, point 11 illuminates the importance of social accountability measures, including regular monitoring, and it encourages member states and other stakeholders to work cooperatively in governance, policymaking, and monitoring. And I think, of course, each state's going to have its own right to develop these mechanisms as they see fit. But I think we should look to establish innovations, develop practical mechanisms, things like civilian oversight boards comprised of university and NGO experts to help assure that integrity. And this builds upon point 15, which also calls for member states to carry out capacity building activities and establish sustainable partnerships in education with other member states and relevant actors, including NGOs. And then building upon this further under the action area dedicated to learning and teaching materials and resources, point 38 calls for the development of materials and resources that are relevant to learners' context and background. So obviously there's some emphasis here that's focusing on encouraging the involvement of teachers and learners in the development of materials. But I think we also need to look to NGOs and other grassroots and non-formal actors because they are, again, particularly knowledgeable of the lived experience of those who are most marginalized and affected. And then finally, complementing this concern, point 40 of the action area supporting learning environments calls for the importance of the integration of experiential learning and social internships. So the learning needs to bring students into the world and the world into the classroom. And the last thing I'll mention would be point 43 under the development of teachers and education personnel. And this is an effort that requires dialogue amongst and between public institution, academic bodies, teachers associations, unions, and communities to shape best practices and authorization. So there's particular important role here for institutions of higher education to play, particularly in the areas of research and teacher training and development. And as we move toward implementation, I think it's going to be crucial for us to engage these institutions of higher education as dynamic and active partners. And I think maybe a practical first step for us, in addition to some of the other spaces for conversations that are emerging, is to do something like convening members of like UNESCO Chairs Network and engage associations, such as Bridge 47 and maybe even the International Association of University Presidents and other kind of key transnational stakeholder university groups in two tracks of conversations. One would be, how can they partner and collaborate towards the implementation of the recommendation in society? And the second track of that is how do they go about integrating and mainstreaming those guiding principles into institutions of higher education themselves? So hopefully I got it under 8 minutes. I'll stop here now and
Good
we'll
job. Thank you. And this concludes the panelist presentations. Thank you all so much for giving us so much to digest and reflect on. So we turn next to Aaron Benevol to give us, as discussant, his take on all we've heard so far. And good luck, Aaron, in pulling all this together. Aaron is professor of global education policy in the School of Education at the University of Albany SUNY and a comparative education researcher and expert in international monitoring of education goals. Among the many other hats he has worn, Aaron is also former director of the Global Education Monitoring Report and co-founder of NESM. And before you begin, NISM, before you begin, Aaron, I'd like to remind participants to please put questions into the Q&A. I'm only seeing 3 so far. So please, as many as possible, we'll try to get them in the last few minutes. Okay, Aaron, please go ahead.
Thanks so much, Jean. And I'd like to begin my comments by, first of all, congratulating Cecilia and Lydia and the team at UNESCO for working so long and so hard and with such, let's say, grit to ensure that this recommendation be finalized and embraced by all UNESCO member states. This is no small feat in and of itself, and I think it needs to be acknowledged and celebrated. I'm not going to try and summarize the many interesting points that have been made by the former speakers. I do just want to emphasize a few things that I took away. So I think Hela, for me, underscored the tension on the one hand between a lot of these international instruments need to reflect what she refers to as an adopted language, the language of past instruments, and often these are incorporated in new instruments. But at the same time, they reflect the historical conditions when these instruments are being put together, whether it be the social, economic, political, and in this case, both environmental and technological changes that were occurring worldwide, and certainly in many parts of the world, that were brought to bear in certain aspects of the recommendation. So even though there's a legacy there that needs to be incorporated, there's some very interesting ways in which the present and a vision of the future gets embraced. And certainly she emphasized the ways in which human rights, the evolution of human rights perspectives have changed over time and are included in the new recommendation. I think Jordan made a very interesting comment that in some sense, maybe inadvertently, the Transforming Education Summit may have kind of taken the carpet under the momentum around some of the issues around the Global Goal on Education, SDG 4, and in particular 4.7. But in some ways, this revised recommendation brings certainly 4.7 right back into the heart of things. So it's a very interesting kind of historical dynamic that's occurred in the last couple of years. Certainly, this revised recommendation brings all the issues and many additional ones that weren't even kind of conceived of in about 10 years ago when the first thinking around 4.7 emerged. So I think in that ways, it does bring us back to a very critical point. And the other point that Jordan made is that a lot of the language in this new recommendation is very much focused on both individual and collective action. Rather than just transforming hearts and minds, it's also the hand. It's also the movement toward getting people to engage in various kinds of activities to bring about the kind of transformations. And in Riley's points, I agree entirely just how important it is in this new recommendation to, first of all, make reference to all the modalities of learning especially non-formal and informal, that were often given short shrift in previous renditions, the importance of lifelong learning, and thinking even of skills. I mean, the ideas of around social emotional learning that are embedded in Target 4.7 under the notion of skills, because there were discussions around both hard skills and soft skills, but in the end, that distinction didn't make it into the final formulation. By bringing in social emotional learning into the recommendation, it's very clear that now it's much more explicit. And I do think that really also emphasized a point that we don't sufficiently take heed of, and that is the importance of getting resources channeled into the implementation process and to various kinds of opportunities that member states will take and other members of civil society. I think the last thing that I would like to say is really around the monitoring, reporting, and what Lydia referred to as policy learning. For me, as having served in as director of the Global Education Monitoring Report, when the new agenda of the SDG agenda was established, the team that I directed spent many days and weeks and months thinking very deeply about how to go about developing a monitoring platform for these very ambitious targets in the global goal. And in particular, Target 4.7 was also, for me at least personally, was enormously central in our thinking. And I must say that I felt a certain level of disappointment when UNESCO decided to use the quadrennial reporting mechanism for every UNESCO recommendation as the basis for monitoring Target 4.7. Because as I've written with my colleague Jim Williams, and I put it in the chat here for you to look at, that you can see that this monitoring mechanism that UNESCO decided on has many problems, and in my view is not fit for purpose. And there are opportunities here, and they need to be seized. And they really do need to involve many different actors, both in civil society and official international agencies and government actors, in trying to much more systematically provide information and evidence of how countries are making progress with respect to this new recommendation, with all the effort. The worst that could happen is that countries, by consensus, have agreed upon a wonderful set of words, but these words in the end have very little teeth and very little kind of reflection in actualities. I know that UNESCO is planning to provide many more documents and guidelines to member states about how the recommendation can be implemented, and we look forward to those. But the monitoring reporting aspect needs to be kind of taken by the horns, and we need to be thinking creatively, innovatively about new ways to reflect on all the multitude of ways in which this recommendation is being embraced and implemented in many different parts of the world. With that, I'll end.
Thank you, Aaron. So we have only 4 minutes left, I'm afraid. So I'd like to pose at least one of the questions from the chat, and perhaps those who you'd like to stay on. What do you think, Tony? We could stay on for another 5 minutes for those who would like to. Does that sound good? Okay, so the question I see that might be the mega question, or one of them, is how are departments and ministries of education being directly engaged in the implementation of the UNESCO recommendation and SDG 4.7? So any of the panelists would like to respond to this? Just go ahead.
I can speak maybe from where I am, which is, it's Hela.
Yeah, yes, thank you, Hela.
Yeah, I'll just speak a little bit from where we are here in South Africa, but I actually think that it's had quite a big impact, especially the combination of the recommendation and the Transforming Education Summit, because since that has happened here in South Africa, we've had agreement from our minister to mainstream a lot of these issues which were formerly seen to be a bit marginal, especially the sustainable development issues. You know, we've had a strong focus on trying to bring human rights and inclusivity into the curriculum and the national system before, but after this round of activities and events, we've seen, a shift actually in the national policy imaginary, if I could call it that. So I think that, it will come through. I really think that Tony's points were so important, were the points about, bringing civil society and all of the education movements into relationship with the education policy system, because it's not something that can be done by one group only. And certainly I think that's, we found that dynamic to be very, very important to have a well-engaged civil society working with the education policy system is, I think, the only way this recommendation is going to make its way through, and it will probably go quite quickly if that is the case. So that's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to speak to that, or shall I go on to the second question? Yes, Willie.
Yeah, thanks. Absolutely great question. And like I said, I think that that's really the most important one, because without the implementation, it's just a paper. And that's exactly what we are trying to support as a Bridge 47, and trying to find more resources on that, how we can really establish about those national so-called STD 4.7 groups, where exactly there's also the civil servants, but the other actors as well, to collectively thinking how to make it. We are doing that in Finland at the moment, but I really would like to see many, many, many more other countries. So I'm happy again to continue about this discussion afterwards. Thanks.
Thank you. Another question from Dr. Mohammed Shahzad. How does UNESCO address the challenge of balancing short-term humanitarian needs with long-term peace-building goals in crisis situations? It's an important question, I think.
I gather that's for me.
Well, anyone who would like to answer?
Well, then,
yes, please.
No one else would like to take the floor. I can say a few words. I mean, I'm not personally involved in the humanitarian work. It's work done by my colleague, and it's a very complex field with a lot of intense discussions at the moment with, unfortunately, the number of crises around the world. But the Summit for the Future and the process that it has engaged among member states is starting up a very important conversation around the need to strengthen that triple nexus between development, humanitarian support, and peace building, and the role of education being a key factor connecting the three. There is regained interest in that, and that though education is not on the agenda of the Summit of the Future per se, or in the sense it's not a standalone topic, it's not a standalone chapter of the outcome document of the Summit of the Futures. It is between the lines being discussed. For UNESCO, of course, it is something we'd like to have recognized in the document, because the new agenda for peace, which is a rest on strengthening prevention methods, necessitates a good understanding of the role that education can play in all its forms, right? And strengthening that role education can play potentially in looking at long-term peace building. So I think there are discussions now looking at those connections. There's an acknowledgement that they're insufficient, that there's a very fragmented understanding, that education is not seen as a primary. Our education in the humanitarian context is about supporting well-being, communities in crisis affected, and seen as psychosocial support, but not on that continuum in terms of post-conflict peace building or in prevention into future builds. So that is probably the area that requires more work. But there's actually thinking going on that, and UNESCO definitely positions itself on that topic very clearly.
Would anybody like to build on what Lydia has just said, or to the question itself?
Jean?
Yes.
Can I say something? And this is not necessarily from UNESCO perspective, but reflecting on both this question and the previous one, from the perspective of some work I'm doing from an individual perspective, supporting both work in Yemen and in Afghanistan, on education sector plans. I think both speak to a critical issue. Many of these crisis-affected contexts, while there's a direct humanitarian response and focusing on, delivery of services, there's still, some kind of de facto authority in place that's working on longer-term planning. And I think what's critical is for the collective actors, both donor community, the country officials, and civil society to be involved in those planning processes. And what's really important, I think, as many of these contexts look towards local level planning, is to get involved at the local level, because there are structures and frameworks even at national level. But the extent to which these issues are both immediately addressing trauma and psychosocial needs in conflict, as well as some longer-term planning, don't necessarily get translated and activated at the local level where it really matters.
Exactly.
So I think that's a key challenge for us as a community. Thank you.
Thank you. And given that we are over time, I think perhaps if Tony, you could speak a little bit on what the takeaways from the meeting are, and then those who wish to leave can leave, and those who wish to stay on longer could do so.
Yeah, thank you, Jean. I think Aaron and others have given us some really wonderful summaries. But maybe the takeaway that I'm thinking about right now builds upon comments by both Really and Jordan, really reminding us that we need to look at this recommendation as a tool for systemic change, which is an abstract thing for us to grasp. And I like the way that Jordan captured this idea. That it is about tinkering towards utopia. So I think takeaway that I think really is really important for us is the need to understand the holistic nature of both reforming education and also of societal and cultural change. So as we look at this tool, we need to understand that the policy in the practice needs to have a holistic framework, a holistic approach. And so we need to, again, integrate both the role of government and civil society as collaborative actors in this endeavor, understanding that each plays different roles in shaping that change agenda. We need to look at the holism between both curricula and teacher training. We didn't talk a lot about teacher training today, but what we know in our field and in our work throughout the years is that curricular adaptations are somewhat meaningless if teachers aren't prepared pedagogically with the methods and pedagogies to be able to engage in the transformative learning necessary to take that learning forward. And then obviously we need to nurture a holistic understanding of peace and what that is, integrating the head, the heart, and that has been talked about by several people today. And I think last but not least, obviously, we need substantial investment to make this change possible. So we need to start sharing some more and more stories of that. Lydia shared a few at the beginning, but we need to make that investment more tangible going forward.
Right. Would anybody else like to make any concluding comments? The last words?
I would like to give a comment from Norway. Okay.
Yes, please.
Yes, thank you. I think that, as it is said, the SDGs are an abstract thing. Even here in Norway, where we should be rather well educated, the ordinary man on the street don't know anything about the SDGs. They are for the specialists. And I think also that we must look at the facts that the number of democracies in the world are decreasing. We see wars and wars and wars in various frames all around. And I think that if we should work on a new agenda for peace, we must go back to start working with the ethics. I remember back in 2002 when we were in Lyon discussing is ethics the missing link. That was the Earth Dialogues review that was around. And I think teaching and training also must be working much harder on ethics. And I miss the close contact between UNESCO and Rotary. There was just a meeting back in Paris now on 4th of May, very impressing that we can get that working. But I think the rotary, for example, the four-way test, maybe in a new form that I met back some years ago, could help us on the way. So we must go back to start with ethics. Thank you.
Thank you. So unless anyone else has something to say, I would just wrap up by saying that my hope is that today's webinar will be one of many such discussions, perhaps organized around the key action areas in the recommendation, with participation from educators across levels and different forms of education. So to take urgent action and to break down the silos. So I'd like to thank everyone, and also for your tolerance and patience.